Hello everyone, I am Braun-Duin and I am joined by the smiling face of...
Chris Van Meter.
God, look at that smiling face. He is just ready to
It's the
battle.
beard. You can't frown with a beard.
You cannot frown with a beard.
So you can try.
You can definitely frown with a goatee though.
But it doesn't work.
Yeah. So what year is it? Is it 2013? I believe it is, because I'm about to be battling with Junk Reanimator. Thrag Tusk, Unburial Rites, Restoration Angel.
Not in this deck.
None of those are in here because they're not legal, because it's actually 2014. But we got a new take on the old favorite of Junk Reanimator. So I started playing this deck last week, and I've been fine-tuning it with a fine-toothed comb over the past few days. And I've not been fine-tuning my hair with that, though, because we don't need to. But and we've definitely gone learned a lot of things about the deck and made a lot of improvements to it. And I actually think the deck right now is very good. If I was playing it in an open, I would be playing this deck. So, and I'm trying to win. So I think this deck's very good, and I think it's just a great, well positioned in the metagame right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So basically, you have only 22 lands and 6 and 7 drops, which seems a little weird. But the deck actually floods out a lot because there's Elvish Mystic, Sylvan Caryatid, Grizzly Salvage, and Satyr Wayfinder, which all accelerate you or find you lands. Mm-hmm. So you use those in the early game to kind of fuel your engine. And the engine, and then you also have Corsair Crewfix, which also helps fuel the engine as well by letting you play lands off the top of your deck, letting you gain some life off of lands, kind of buys you time to get into the late game with his portly body and the life gain he provides. So you kind of use that in the early game to kind of set up. And then your late game is Whip of Erebos, along with all these creatures. You can whip back anything that you've milled over. And then you have Obzedat's Aid. And Obzedat's Aid actually returns any permanent to play, which is very important because one of the great things you can do is you can actually return Whip back to play, which is huge. Like if you have like a Sylvan Primordial in play or Shadowborn Demon or stuff, returning a Whip gives those guys lifelink, and Whip is just so powerful in this deck to whip back all these kinds of creatures. You can also return Elspeth's Son's Champion back to play,
which is real cute.
It's very good. So a lot of times what you can do is like cast a Satyr Wayfinder on turn 2 or 3, mill over an Elspeth, and then on turn 4 just Obzedat's Aid back Elspeth. And if you thought Elspeth was good on turn 6, she's much better on turn 4.
Much better.
Yeah, so there's a lot of powerful interactions. We also have Whip Obzedat is another interaction. You can whip back Obzedat and stack the trigger so that you get to keep your Obzedat permanently instead of exiling him to the Whip. That's another sweet thing we have. Whip and Shadowborn Demon is just a great way to, you can like play a Shadowborn Demon, kill one of your opponent's creatures, sacrifice itself to its own ability in your upkeep, whip it back, kill another guy, gain a bunch of life from the lifelink and stuff. So there's a lot of neat interactions there. And then Sylvan Primordial is actually just extremely powerful. There's a lot of cards like Underworld Connections being played, Elspeth, Xenagos, Domri, just tons of Planeswalkers.
Detention Sphere. Yeah,
Detention Sphere. There's just a ton of awesome permanents like that being played. And you can use Sylvan Primordial to blow them up, get a land. If you have a Corsair in play, you get to gain a life. And you get to... and Sylvan Primordial also works really well with Whip because it's big, it has reach, it has lifelink, etc. When you have a Whip in play. So there's just a lot of like really awesome interactions between all the cards in this deck. And really, Satyr Wayfinder is kind of the key that holds it all together. He just does so many different things. A lot of times you actually end up able to win the game by just attacking your opponent with like a Corsair and a Satyr Wayfinder and a Sin Collector against some of the opponents like Mono Black where they're just stuck with a bunch of removal spells. They don't want to burn their removal on your Satyr Wayfinder, but he ends up doing a huge chunk of damage over the course of the game. He also does things like sacrifice to Desecration Demon, sacrifice to your Shadowborn Demon, and so forth. And another nifty thing you can do is you can actually whip back Satyr Wayfinder if you don't have any other good targets in your yard, and he might mill you over like the Sylvan Primordial that you need for next turn. So he really is the glue that like holds this deck together. He does so many different things, and it's just a really powerful card. And I like the fact that kind of like Mulch in the old Junk Reanimator decks, you can actually Obzedat's Aid a Wayfinder if you need to dig further through your deck. And you can never really do that with Mulch. Sometimes with the old Reanimator, you'd be stuck with like 3 Unburial Rites in your hand, nothing to get back. Now you can like Obzedat's Aid back a mulch to dig you further, or any of your other permanents. So the deck has a lot of synergies. There's a lot of very powerful effects. And I also think the deck is actually pretty difficult to play optimally because you have so many different options every turn, and you have things like Scrylands. And Scrylands, you have things like Scrylands, Corsair Crewfix, along with ways to dig through your deck. And those kind of interact weirdly. Like, if you have a Scryland that you're planning on playing for the turn, you always want to play your Satyr Wayfinder before you play the Scryland, because you want to mill over 4 cards, and then you want to scry to set up your next draw. Whereas if you play the Scryland first, you're just setting up a card you're about to mill over with Satyr Wayfinder. It doesn't actually help you at all. So there's a lot of like timing issues and things like that, and I think the more you play with the deck and the more comfortable you get with it, the more mileage you're going to get by correctly making all those plays in the right sequence. There's a lot of interesting sequencing. But all in all, I think this deck has a lot of game against a lot of different decks. You have a huge top end, so you can go over the top of many decks. But because of like Sin Collector and Corsair Crewfix and things like that, you actually have a pretty good early game as well, so that you're not just dead to some of these super aggressive decks to buy you time to get to this bigger stuff. So yeah, I actually think this deck's very good. I'm really excited to give it a shot here. So,
Sweet.
But let's go ahead and take a look at the sideboard. Starting off, we have 3 Pelucranos World Eater.
Who is usually very familiar with his spot on the sideboard.
Yeah.
He rides the bench pretty well.
Yeah, nah, he usually doesn't. But he's in the sideboard here for some of the aggressive decks and mono blue. He's just a great answer to like Master of Waves and things like that. And he's also very good with Whip of Erebos against decks like the Burn deck. So he's kind of an all-star coming in at some of like the super aggressive matchups. I don't ever want him against like the mono black decks or the black-white decks or the Esper decks or things like that. But I definitely like him a lot in the aggressive matchups. And he basically comes in to fill like an earlier part of the curve there, where we can kind of play like the Corsair, Polykranos, bunch of removal spell game plan against those decks. Sin Collector, 2 more Sin Collectors. I have 2 mains, so 4 total. I had Thoughtseize on the board at one point, but it just wasn't really doing it for me because it doesn't kind of synergize with the whole creature theme of the deck. But Sin Collector does basically the same thing and is just extremely powerful against Burn, Mono Black, and Esper. And that's exactly where you want Sin Collectors. We have 4 Bioblights, and this was originally 0, but I realized that I was winning most of the time except a Pack Rat. I was losing every time my opponent played a turn 2 Pack Rat. And that was really the only card out of Mono Black that was giving me significant problems. So I decided, I'd add a couple of Bioblights, and it went from 2 to 3 to 4. And now I'm just all in on Bioblight. And
Bioblight's also good against like mono blue.
Yes.
Any of the other aggressive type decks. We're seeing recently that there's a lot more aggressive decks people are playing, and Bioblight's just very good.
It is. It's exceptional against those decks, and people don't see it coming either. No one really expects Bioblight out of a deck like this because, when you're Grizzly salvaging and things, people expect more permanence. But yeah, Bioblight's very good against a lot of decks right now. And then 2 Abrupt Decay. I like Abrupt Decay just as another cheap removal option against certain decks. Can kill Chain to the Rocks, Detention Sphere, things like that as well. But this is probably the weakest card in the sideboard, so if you feel the need to change anything, I would say Abrupt Decay is probably the first cut you would make. But it is still very versatile, and I still like having it there. We have 3 Blood Barons. This is for all the mono black style decks, but it's also good against Burn, and it's also good against white aggro. So any kind of Boros Elite type deck, any kind of Voiced Fleecemane Lion style deck, Blood Baron really shines against those decks a lot. However, I would never bring this in against any aggressive deck that does not have those kinds of cards. I do not want this against mono green or green red or any kind of a green deck like that. I just don't want Blood Baron against those decks because he trades or dies to everything. And then we have a 3rd Shadowborn Demon, which comes in against a lot of the creature decks, things like mono blue, green red, etc., is where you want a 3rd copy of Shadowborn Demon. Even though you don't always have enough 6 guys in your yard, what Shadowborn Demon does is he kills their biggest threat, and then he brick walls them for an entire turn because they don't want to blow a Gore Clan Rampager trying to get through your Shadowborn Demon when you're probably just gonna have to sack it next turn anyway. So usually what happens is they end up just having to pass the turn without an attack. And then you get to untap, and you can either just sacrifice the demon and then try to Obzat aid it back into play or whip it back into play, or sometimes, a lot of times, you'll sacrifice like a Satyr Wayfinder if they have like a Domri or a Xenagos that you want to kill. So usually what Shadowborn Demon ends up doing is like killing their best threat, killing a Planeswalker, and then later being in your graveyard as like, a way to get back a removal spell when you need it. So he's very powerful against those decks. But all in all, I think the sideboard plan is like pretty versatile and lets you really change direction against a lot of different decks, which is pretty important. So. But all in all, I think this deck's awesome. Hopefully, we'll get to see it not get smashed by Brush Strider in our upcoming video.
Man. Burning Tree Emissary, one time.
Burning Tree into Brush Strider. Can't win. But yeah, I think this deck's pretty sweet, so hopefully you'll give it a shot and enjoy it as much as I have.